The first time I read Dracula, well, it was when I was in university, and I have to admit, it was like hard work. It was difficult. The sentence structure, the dialects, the period language, I think I got just too caught up in understanding every word. And probably about the one-third point through the novel, I just relaxed and started reading it for what it was, and just to get into the drama and the action. And then I got really caught up in the different perspectives. Obviously, the epistolary style of the novel was really interesting because you get from different perspectives, the different characters' perspective, what was happening as they all began to figure out who the vampire was and what was going to happen to them if they weren't careful. I found it fantastic, but as I said, it was hard getting into the novel the first time. Then, of course, I read it 2 or 3 times and really picked up on Bram's writing style, and much easier to read after that.
So, my first experience of reading the novel Dracula came after seeing the Hammer Dracula film. So, when I was 8.5, our family got our first video recorder. Shortly after that, BBC Two, which is one of the main channels in the UK, broadcast a late night double bill featuring Hammer's Curse of Frankenstein and Dracula. My dad recorded both, and he obviously judged that this was suitable watching material for his 8.5-year-old daughter, and he was right. I absolutely loved it. That was my first introduction to the story, and I was obviously really taken by it, by Dracula in particular, because I went out and bought myself a copy of the novel with my pocket money soon afterwards and devoured that. This, in fact, it's the exact copy of the novel which I bought, and I know how old I was when I bought it because of when this was printed, so I know I was still only 8 years old. It didn't seem to be a problem. I read it, I devoured it, I absolutely loved it. I think when I first read it, because I'd seen the film very recently and that was what had inspired me to buy the novel, at that age as well, I wasn't really distinguishing very clearly between them. I knew that the version of the story in the novel was different from the film, and I already at that age I understood that that was often the case with films. But I was definitely visualising the characters from Hammer's film the first time I read the novel. So obviously I've reread it multiple times since then, and as I've got older, eventually I learned to kind of distinguish it from the Hammer film, come up with my own ideas of what Bram's characters were supposed to be like and what the settings might look like. I think those things change for me actually every single time I read the novel. Kind of they rewrite themselves in my mind as I read it. And now I can enjoy the novel and enjoy the Hammer film separately as works of art in their own right. But they are still very, very closely tied together for me because that was how I discovered the novel. I still think the Hammer film is probably the best adaptation of the novel ever made, and that doesn't mean it's the most faithful version, but I think it really gets to the essence of what's in the novel extremely effectively, as well as being an absolutely wonderful film in its own right. And I do think faithful is what I'm looking for anyway when I watch an adaptation of Dracula. I don't think an entirely faithful screen version of the novel would work. Certainly not now in the 21st century. I think it would come across as sort of unintentionally camp and hokey. So I'm happy with all sorts of versions. I think one of the great things about Dracula is that it's inspired so many very different film versions. They're all interesting, all enjoyable in their own right. But for me, it still always comes back to the Hammer version of Dracula. Novel is the greatest thing of all, but the Hammer film version is absolutely the best version of it for me.
When I first got started reading novels, I started with science fiction, Arthur Clarke, Robert Heinlein, etc. And then I discovered horror, and then I discovered vampires. And then I got hooked on vampires. And I'd read 25 or 30 vampire novels and sort of said to myself, yeah, you should read Dracula. So I went out and bought a cheap little dime store copy of Dracula, started reading it. And first time I did that, I got bogged down real quick and just said, not a great novel. I put it aside. And I read a few more vampire novels and said, oh, I really need to read Dracula. So I went back to it, tried it again, same reaction. And it was only the third time that I read Dracula that I really got into it. And once I got into the third, fourth chapter, then I was hooked. I said, here is a story. This is good stuff. And by the time you have the scene with the boat, the Demeter coming into Whitby Harbor, this is a great novel. And I finished it without any problem. Of course, since then I've read it 5 or 6 times, but that was my first experience of reading Dracula.
Actually, as with all things horror, I was actually fairly late to it because I did a sort of previous lifetime first of doing furniture design stuff before coming back to academia. It was actually during my master's when I was, oh crikey, 40-something years old. So I ended up choosing for my dissertation to write about how vampires were a site of memory for America. So it's via how they use films to create their own identity. And of course, Lugosi's film was the main thing. So to be able to discuss Lugosi's film, I had to read the source material, of course. And it was okay. As always, there's kind of really good bits and you're really into it and you think, oh, like, I thought they were supposed to stab him with like a cross or crucifix or stake him or something, and then there's knives involved. What's that about? So it was really interesting, but a lot of it you just kind of thought, oh, can't we move it along a bit faster? But no, it was really good, and of course since then it's just been one of those continual sources for things to go back to.
Yes, I think I had already seen one film adaptation by the time I had read the novel, and I remember reading the novel thinking it was beautifully descriptive, and I was waiting for those sort of, those big beats that we think of in the film. So Jonathan Harker's arrival at Castle Dracula, the description, the lusciousness of it. But I remember I was about, I think, 11 or 12 and reading it and being quite amazed that this was an Irish novel by an Irish novelist. This was a profoundly important book. And at the same time, it had my fascination. It wasn't just, Tommy literature. It was so much more than that. It had this sense of adventure and excitement and terror. It had everything that you would want to read as an 11-year-old. But at the same time, it was this classic piece of literature. So that had, of course, multiple film adaptations out of it already at that point. So I think for me, it was that experience of the encounter with Gothic fiction and the full impact of that. So that's what I mostly remember from that first reading of Dracula.
Yes, so I was I went to a boarding school in England, really quite young, at the age of 7. And one of the customs of this school was for naughty boys to stay up late and under the blankets of the bed in the dormitory with a torch to read a book long after the lights had gone out, and you weren't allowed to do this. And I got hold of a paperback edition of Dracula published by Arrow Books in England, with a very frightening cover of the Count standing there with a clean shaven, looking a bit like Christopher Lee, with the castle in the background. And that was my introduction. I read it night after night by torchlight underneath the blankets, not just terrified of the book, but terrified that one of the masters would come in and discover me reading it, at which point I'd probably be punished. So yeah, that was my experience. And what's remarkable about Dracula is you can read it as a child and it stays in your mind. You then revisit it in your teens and it means something completely different. And you then revisited it, a lot later, in my case, in my 30s, And it's like reading a different book. This book contains legions, depending on what you bring to it with your own experiences, as much as what you've got on the page. But it certainly put all sorts of images in my head. And in some ways, I've been trying to exorcise the demon ever since. And it's taken a very, very long time.
My first experience reading Dracula is a funny path, because the thing that inspired me to read the novel in particular was actually seeing Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula from 1992 on VHS, when my interest in vampires was kicking in around 1993-94. After watching that, I decided to seek out the novel itself, which happened to be in my high school library, and it took me a few months to read. It wasn't the length of that book, 400 odd pages, was something that I wasn't used to doing at that time. So I'd read little bits and pieces over time. But what I recall about it was how immersive it was, so rich in detail. I don't think I knew it was an epistolatory novel, like a compilation of diary extracts and newspaper clippings and various things. So that was a bit of an eye-opener. I found maybe the ending a little bit anticlimactic. You'd think there'd be something a lot more dramatic for the demise of Dracula. And actually there was. In Stoker's original, I believe, typescript for the book, it wasn't just Dracula who disintegrates, but his castle as well. But that was chopped. That scene was chopped from the final manuscript that was put out to print. So there could have been a lot more drama to it, but I suppose it would have made it a little bit too unrealistic at the end, all things considered. But yeah, it was a very it was a great book. It's certainly one that I think all vampire scholars and everyone interested in vampires should read. It's left such an impact on our general societal interest in vampires, to the point where a lot of what Stoker wrote about is still used as a template today, in our conscious awareness of what we think a vampire looks like, but also for many writers.
My first experience reading the novel Dracula was twofold. I was rather young at the time, and I was so familiar with films about Dracula and vampires that I was puzzled truly by Stoker's description of Dracula, how much it varied from really the dominant Bela Lugosi style visual appearance of the vampire. So my first reaction to the novel was to be puzzled by how he described Dracula. My second reaction is one that continues to the present day. The novel is so rich. It comes at the fin de siècle. It's got modern at least, technology, the Kodak camera, the phonograph, and yet it is so beautifully unhurried as a novel. It really is rooted in the 19th century literary tradition, even as it was looking to the 20th. And so my ongoing reaction is how each time I go back to it, there's so much there. It's so rich. Every return visit, it's like finding something new about an old friend.
My first experience reading the novel of Dracula probably came later than it did for many other people that you're asking in this project, which it probably came, I think I read it when I was at university. Being a film and TV person, I first came across Dracula through film and TV adaptations. So with the Bela Lugosi, Dracula, The Count from Sesame Street, Nosferatu. These are the texts that first kind of developed my interest in the vampire and in Dracula. And it was at university, when I was considering doing a dissertation on vampire films, that I decided I want to read the novel Dracula to, ground what my project in this kind of legacy. And I was immediately struck by how modern a story it was. Having grown up watching kind of adaptations where Dracula of Dracula, which were largely period dramas, costume dramas, always set in the Victorian era or in the Edwardian era. But when you read the novel, it's not set in a period drama, it's contemporary. You know, he's set in a very contemporary London. That happened to be, you know, the 1890s, but at the time he was writing, that was the modern day. And that really comes across in the novel, that you don't feel like you're reading a text that has that kind of period setting, emphasizing costume drama, emphasizing, you know, a historical quality, but it feels really, as he says in the book, up to date with a vengeance. And I think that is what really excited me about it. Suddenly I really became aware of this story as being very modern, feeling that that Stoker was tapping into the very contemporary changes and experiences of the city in particular. So Dracula circulates so comfortably and easily and invisibly around the city in a way that I found really surprising. And I think what struck me when I read it was how that modernity seemed at odds with how it's often been adapted, which is feeling very period drama, feeling very much of the past. And I thought that was really interesting that there is that disjuncture between the actual mode of writing and how it's been adapted in a very fundamental way. And I found it really exciting in the novel that this is very vibrant, very contemporary. And it has meant that I've always kind of been curious about adaptations and the different ways in which the pressure to set it in period and the hesitancy of setting it in the modern era, which would make it feel more in keeping with the style of the book. And one of the things I've often thought is that it should be adapted as a found footage Gothic story. And if you think of found footage in the style of films like The Bay or even the Blair Witch Project, where you have a kind of collection of different media that's been used, or something like Diary of the Dead, where what someone's put together different stories and different like elements, different media, different, you know, people's home video recordings and news reports, etc. That style of found footage filmmaking would work really well to capture a very modern equivalent to Stoker's epistolary structure, in which he does have personal journals and newspaper articles and recordings, and people are recording these moments in different media. And the found footage seemed to be very much in keeping. And I keep hoping that someday someone will try that as a style of telling the story that might make it feel very contemporary in a way that Stoker had originally written the novel.
My first experience reading the Dracula novel only took place after I had produced a photo story based on the Dracula narrative. The Ultimate Dracula was created in 2010, 2011, published in 2012 during the centenary of Bram Stoker's death. And only when this photo story was ready and I was trying to search for the location of Castle Dracula, I started to dig into the original text. And of course this provided me with a lot of new details and triggered a whole lot of new questions that I'm still intrigued by. But on the other hand, I must admit that I don't think it was the best story ever written. It is a bit tedious at places, it is sentimental, it is repetitive, especially when you compare it to a novel like Captain Vampire that was written by the young Marie Nizet, 90 years old. I hope I don't disappoint too many Dracula fans with this, but I think that Nizet's story was better written than Stoker's novel.
When I first read Dracula, I think I was fairly young back then, and I definitely read it in my native language, which is Czech. Now, whether that's because I read a translation or whether that's because I was fairly young, I don't know, but anyway, I was not very sensitive to the ambiguities of the novel and what the vampire does to all objects and beings that it comes into contact with. So I read it as, fairly naively as a story about a struggle between the good and evil, and The good wins and the evil is defeated.
I am sure that I read the book at some time in my teenage years, but it didn't really make a significant impression on me at that point. My first real experience reading Stoker's Dracula was as part of a vampires in film and literature course with Professor Nina Auerbach at the University of Pennsylvania in 1990. And I didn't know this at the time, but this was the launching point for her later book publication, Our Vampires, Ourselves, which is a very significant contribution to vampire studies and which came out in 1995. Reading the book together with someone deeply invested in the subject was a very rewarding experience, and one from which I learned quite a bit about the themes that are present in the novel, especially things like sexuality, race, and immigration, the construction of the novel, the influences on Stoker that went into the novel, and so on. So as I reflect on that experience, it reminds me that these things are not necessarily transparent to younger readers. Those of us, therefore, who teach Stoker and Dracula have a wonderful opportunity to introduce them to the novel in a way that highlights the themes that are present and the curious construction of the work.
My first experience reading Dracula by Bram Stoker came as a very late experience, actually, taking into consideration the socio-political situation in my country. I'm from Poland, and before 1989, we didn't have much access to the Western culture in general. So when you came across a film or some bit of literature of this sort, especially the horror literature, was translated, that was a big festivity, and everyone wanted to read it and get to know the film or the book. So I got acquainted with Dracula as a cinematic experience. That was my first contact with Dracula when I was in high school. So I was already in my late teens when I came across Nosferatu, so the German expressionist classic, and later on the version with Mr. Bela Lugosi that is standing right behind my back right now, and that was absolutely extraordinary on every possible level. First of all, the first one is silent cinema, of course. So this was completely abstract. I was always drawn to these old films, but that was all of a sudden a silent cinema horror. So it blew my mind off at that time, and I got fascinated ever since. Later on, as I said, I saw the Bela Lugosi version, so Todd Browning version, and Dracula was a talkie all over, so it became more and more interesting. So what's the whole story about? But it was actually a few years later when I read the book for the first time, and I was already a student at my university here in Lublin, Poland, where I was studying English studies. So we had a big, among others, we had a big literature course. And Dracula was not our obligatory reading, but I do remember reading this particular book in English. So my first experience is reading Dracula as an original version. And that was fantastic on many levels. Well, language, of course, but all of a sudden I got drawn into this world of Bram Stoker, of lush descriptions of characters, but picturing the characters as I've never seen them before. I actually remember reading those letters by Jonathan Harker and others, and thinking, oh my goodness, Dracula has a voice. He actually talks. So that was quite a surprise after watching Nosferatu and after watching Todd Browning's version, that he actually talked, and he talks a lot. He's quite a chatter, isn't he? He was explaining quite a lot about his background, about his fascinations with literature, science, and so on and so on. So that was the first thing that struck me, that this is such a very much different story from what we were shown in early cinema. And of course, I'm not criticizing the cinema. This is what I what I adore about pop culture, about the world in general. So cinema is fantastic, and the productions were, especially those old productions, I love them very much. But that all of a sudden, reading the book opened quite a new dimension to the book. Also, apart from being surprised about Dracula being able to actually express himself, I also loved that the characters were drawn, other characters in the novel were drawn in such a detailed way. So all of a sudden you have Jonathan Harker, who is very often only a background character in the movies, and then you have Mina with all her fascination with science, with inventions of the modern world, and she was such a strong, wonderfully strong character, which I never suspected from the films. And then of course you have Van Helsing, who is the fascination for so many other stories, and as much as Dracula is now part of the pop culture and our everyday world, really so much is Van Helsing. As well, I was in my 20s when I read Dracula for the first time, and first of all, I never wanted to stop. So that's why we are talking right now here, because I decided to pursue the subject, and it's in the end it became the biggest part of my life academically, and I'm still not finished with Dracula, and I don't think I ever will be. And the other thing is how strong a character must be. So how wonderful is this character of Dracula, that he managed to survive for such a long time in the midst of pop culture. It is so easy to just have a year or so of fame and then disappear into thin air. But Dracula is still alive, and he's even more present now than he used to be at the very start. So we have all these pop cultural phenomenon that came out from the novel, from the 19th century novel, which is, I can imagine that for the modern reader, it's quite archaic in language and ideas as well. He's with us, and we're celebrating the 125th anniversary of publication of this wonderful book. And well, it changed my life, and it continues to be changing my life, and it probably always will.
My first experience was when I was probably a child, and I read Frankenstein first. That was my first mistake, because Mary Shelley was very, and then Bram Stoker is just very long-winded in his writing, and you have to get through it. And I think I was bored the first time I read it. But then as a scholar later, when I read it, I was like, oh, this is thick. It has so much innuendo, and it's got so much. I can see where everybody was basing their film on, and their movies, film and movies, and just everything. I could see it because it was so thick of character, which made it probably why it's probably the best out there in the written genre. And I was just amazed the second time. And then when I read it, off and on, it was still good. And then I made my daughter read it because it was so good, but just a different kind of version of it. But it was awesome. It was an awesome experience the second time around.
Well, I first read Dracula in 1970 when I was teaching high school English in Eaton, Ohio. I had a group of crazy advanced students in one class and decided to introduce them to subtleties of point of view. One of my students, Lawrence Poos, introduced me to Dracula. Larry is now a history professor and dean at the Catholic University of America. He's the author of, I looked this up, you can Google anybody, author of A Rural Society After the Black Death, Essex, 1350 to 1525. So I think he's stuck with his Gothic interest. was published by Cambridge in 1991. And I really should reach out to him to thank him for turning me on to Dracula, which at the time wasn't often taught in schools. Larry mentioned Dracula as a different take on the epistolary novel, and I have been fascinated with its narration ever since. In fact, I've written on that or touched on it in a lot of what I've written. I was horrified by the savage delight that the men in the novel seemed to take in destroying the vampire Lucy. I'm still horrified by that. And by the fact that Mina, who was so central to the battle against Dracula, is so diminished by the conclusion. I taught one more year of high school English, and we won't even go into all of the complicated reasons I left. Before deciding to return to grad school. And I continued to study Dracula in grad school in the 1970s. I managed to work Dracula into my dissertation when I chose to look at vampires in 19th century English literature. In fact, one of my first published articles once I left grad school had to do with the way that Dracula is told through diaries, newspaper clippings, etc. And I've been studying Dracula ever since.
Listen to them, children of the night. What music they make.